What's up, guys? Welcome to episode 4 of the Two Guys Talk Sports podcast presented by Mr. G's Podcast Productions. We're excited to be back. Let's get right into it. So our number of the day today is number 14 for DK Metcalf, who went on First Take earlier this week. And when Stephen A. Smith said to him that we've seen many talented wide receivers in the league, what do you think makes you special? He looked him dead in the eyes and said that you've never seen a wide receiver with a 40-inch vertical who runs a 4.33, 6'3", 230 pounds. He said, you've never seen anyone like me. And honestly, he just stared right into Stephen A's soul, and Stephen A had nothing to say back to him.
Yes, Stephen A brought up Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and a couple other all-time great wide receivers saying, we've seen players change the game. We don't know if you're going to be as special, basically just questioning him. DK just comes right back with this quote. It's an all-time quote. He's basically selling himself. He's saying, watch out, I'm a beast. So, it's going to be a fun season, I think.
As impressive as that exchange was, I do have to agree with DK Metcalf. He isn't anywhere close to the talent level of any of those guys. I think he's a guy who's kind of overrated, and you saw that on draft night. He slipped in the draft. But anyway, it is now May 2nd, and because of that, May Madness is coming up in college lacrosse. Let's check out the Inside Lacrosse media poll, and who do you like this year in the tournament?
Obviously, Penn State's still sitting at number 1. They've had an unbelievable season. No one seemed to have an answer for their offense except that one loss earlier in the year. So I'm going to be watching out for those two teams from Pennsylvania.
I think another team that's really hot right now is Virginia. Virginia played pretty tough schedule all year. They're in the ACC, so a ton of great teams there. They also played another team that I've been following along with all year, which is High Point. High Point beat Duke early in the year. They also beat Virginia. They have a couple tough losses, but I think that this is a team that's pretty talented. Can definitely stun some teams early on in the tournament.
I remember watching earlier in the year that Duke game, and I was looking at this High Point team. I was wondering if they were actually good, if this Duke team wasn't settled yet. But then, like you said, they came back with that win against Virginia later in the season, and right now they're ranked number 11, which is pretty good considering High Point is High Point. And I think it's going to be fun to see how they do it in the tournament.
Definitely. Since we're from Massachusetts, I think we have to highlight a team that's really hot in the CAA right now, the number 1 seed in the CAA tournament, the UMass Minutemen. They're going to probably end up playing number 12 Towson in the final of the CAA. And since they're ranked 13th right now, I think that's going to be a really great matchup. I hope they can pull it out.
Yeah, that should be a fun game. UMass, not typically known for lacrosse, but in the past couple of years, they've been growing that program. And this year, they're in full throttle. Last year, they lost in the first round to Yale, I believe, who ended up winning the national championship. This year, UMass is a team to be reckoned with, though.
And honestly, I think when you look back on that tournament last year, UMass was probably the team besides Duke who gave Yale team a really close game and a really tough matchup. And so hopefully they can continue that this year. One team that I was a little disappointed by, I've only been to one college lacrosse game this year, and it happened to be Loyola BU. Pat Spencer, the Tewaaraton favorite at this point in the year. I saw him, wasn't really too impressed. BU kind of locked him down all game, and BU was actually able to pull out a pretty big victory there. And to me, that kind of exposed that even though BU is definitely a talented team, I could see them making the tournament. Loyola has a lot of holes, and I think that right now they're ranked 6th in the country. I think that's pretty high. I don't think that they're the 6th best team in the country.
Yeah, earlier this year, Pat Spencer was taking the lacrosse world by absolute storm. He was doing all those crease dives, those jump goals, amazing passes, amazing finishes. But one attackman isn't enough to fuel an entire team, especially in college lacrosse when there's so many special players in so many different places. So Loyola definitely started off hot. They're still ranked number 6, but I wouldn't be surprised to see an early exit come to tournament time just based on their holes, like you said.
Definitely. Speaking of tournaments, what are you thinking about the Stanley Cup matchups going on in the NHL right now? What surprised you?
All right, so right now, the most surprising thing, I think, to every NHL fan is the Carolina Hurricanes are up 3-0 on the New York Islanders in the second round. They are 1 win away from advancing to the Eastern Conference Finals. What do you think about that?
I think we had said that the Islanders were going to be a pretty tough out in the playoffs. I think we can pretty safely say now that we were wrong about that. Carolina's just been annihilating them. Last night, they completely throttled them. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Islanders aren't playing in Nassau and that they've been playing in Brooklyn. I think they need to bring the games back to Nassau because this team has looked completely lifeless this series.
Yeah, if they can even bring it back to Nassau. Keep in mind that this fourth game is at Carolina. So, anyways, Bruins, Columbus. Bruins are down 2-1. It's been a great series so far. Oliver, I believe, said Columbus in 7 games. I said Boston in 6. Still a possibility. Bruins have been playing well. So has Columbus. Sergei Bobrovsky has been an absolute stonewall in net for them. What do you think about this series?
Yeah, well, I wish I could say otherwise, Brendan, but as the famous quote goes, they are who we thought they were. The Bruins have kind of just fallen apart this series. Some poor goaltending in Game 1. They came back and actually won that game. Then they lost Game 2, lost Game 3. They're on a slide right now. They really need to turn it around in Game 4, or else I really can't see them winning this series. This is a pretty crucial game for the Bruins.
Yeah, if they lose this next game, we might be able to kiss that one goodbye. In the Western Conference, the St. Louis Blues and the Dallas Stars are tied 2-2.
I think I ended up saying Blues in 6.
Blues in 6. Definitely said Blues in 6. The Stars are good. They're still playing well. I mean, they're obviously giving this Blues team a fight, but I think ultimately the Blues will be able to pull out this series.
And how about this Colorado-San Jose series down at the bottom here?
So, Colorado initially won home ice advantage, technically winning a game on the road in San Jose. They were coming back to Colorado, hoping that the altitude would help them take a 3-1 series lead over the Sharks, but the Sharks came out hot in Game 3 and ended up winning that game, so now the Sharks are winning that series 2-1.
I think we had touched on this in another one of our podcasts, but the Sharks are just a team that, even when their backs are against the wall, that's when they're playing their best hockey.
Yeah, we saw that in the first round. They were down 3-1 to the Golden Knights in the series. They came back, then they were down in that Game 7, but they came back, so Sharks are a team to watch for.
Yeah, I think the Sharks honestly kind of have Colorado where they want right now, just given that they are so talented at playing in series where they're losing. And that might not be a good thing, but for San Jose, they think it is.
Well, per usual, the Stanley Cup playoffs are shaping up to be very exciting, as we expected. Hopefully that keeps up, and we'll bring you guys another check-in once we get the next podcast.
So, now moving on to the NBA playoffs, we have Golden State up 2-0 on Houston.
So we've seen Game 1. We all talked about that already. The fouls, the missed calls, the technicals, all that. Game 2, the Rockets did their best. Steph Curry got hurt, not even comparable to the loss that the Rockets had with James Harden injuring his eye early in the first quarter. And he said to the reporters, "I barely can see."
And that makes those shots that he was hitting all the more impressive, that it's just a feel shot.
Yeah, maybe he was exaggerating, but obviously you could see that cut in his left eye. Both eyes were watering, so definitely in some distress.
Touching on the Golden State-Houston series a little bit more, I hate to be the optimist here, but I think that the Rockets, as much as they are down 2-0, and it's going to be hard to go 4-1 against this Warriors team the rest of the way, especially with Kevin Durant playing as well as he has been, I think that they still have a chance. They lost both games by single digits, and you saw James Harden missed a significant amount of time. He said he couldn't see the rim. For them to only lose that game by, I believe, 6 points is pretty impressive and a testament that the rest of this team isn't exactly a bunch of slouches like we thought that they were, and that they can handle this Golden State team. So I think I could see Houston coming back and winning both games at home, maybe taking this to Golden State, and if they can win a game in Golden State, I could still see them taking this series.
Yeah, Game 3, super important for the Rockets. Have to come out, have to win. Game 4, basically the same. Cannot afford going down 3-1, or 3-0, that is, to the Golden State Warriors.
Definitely.
Shifting gears in the West, we have the Portland Trail Blazers versus the Denver Nuggets. That series is tied at 1. Oliver, what are your thoughts on that series right now?
Well, I don't know if you watched the game last night, but Torrey Craig went down with a broken nose in, I believe, the first or second quarter. Ended up coming back in the fourth, hit a crucial 3, was playing his trademark great defense. And that's just what you love to see in the playoffs, a guy who's not willing to let an injury, even as serious as a broken nose, keep him from coming back and helping out his team.
Yes.
That's really impressive to me.
Yeah, sticking tough with it, came back in the game, like you said, played good defense, hit some crucial shots. It wasn't enough, though, as the Trailblazers did end up edging out that game. Damian Lillard didn't play as well as we expected in that game, too, yet his teammates kind of picked up the slack, and then they evened that series at 1.
Oh, he was awful. And I think one thing to keep an eye on, I guess, as the rest of the series goes on is it may have just been because Dame was having a bad night, but the last 2 possessions of this game where Portland needed a bucket, CJ McCollum was the one with the ball, and he was going in isolation. And since the Trailblazers used Dame the entire series against OKC as a closer, it was interesting to see them switch up to McCollum.
It's nice to see that, though. As we both said previous, we know CJ McCollum is a great player. He can shoot the ball. He can play ISO, apparently. Damian Lillard obviously carrying the weight of this team, but don't forget about CJ McCollum. He's playing a very big role for this Trailblazer squad.
Why don't we move on to the Philadelphia-Toronto series first before we hit my personal favorite series, the Celtics and Bucks. So what are you thinking about the Raptors and the Sixers?
If we're being real, I've watched both of these games. I know the 76ers kind of clapped the Raptors in Game 2. Honestly, I think the Raptors are going to win this series in 5 or 6 games.
I really, really, really would love to see Philadelphia win this, so that the Celtics or the Bucks could absolutely annihilate them in the conference finals again.
Me too.
However, I think Kawhi's playing really well still. Pascal Siakam is also a really great player, really talented. I agree. I think Toronto's going to win this series. I could see Philadelphia pushing this to 7 games, but I think Toronto's going to end up winning.
I mean, in our ideal situation, I'd love to see the 76ers in the Eastern Conference Finals because they get embarrassed by either the Celtics or the Bucks. And like where you said, switching gears, Boston and the Bucks are tied 1 apiece coming back to Boston. Oliver, what do you think about that series?
Well, I think as a Celtics fan, you got to love that Celtics have basically secured a home court advantage now after winning that Game 1. And I just think that there are some very small adjustments that the Celtics could make. And I think one of them, it's not something that you see a lot in the NBA, but it would help if your best players could actually score the basketball.
Kyrie Irving, wake up.
Kyrie was an embarrassment. Jason Tatum, 5 points. Gordon Hayward, 5 points. You're not going to win a series doing that. And you look at a team like the Bucks, Giannis had 20+. Chris Middleton had an amazing night. He had 20+. Those are the guys who are showing up, and they're carrying their team. The Celtics need that.
Granted, Milwaukee did have to win that game to avoid going down 2-0 heading back to Boston, so I see how they came out with that fire in the third quarter, and the Celtics maybe weren't clicking as well. But still, Celtics need to pick it up if they want to finish this series early.
An interesting thing to mention here, just because for whatever reason the NBA continues to put Scott Foster and Tony Brothers into these playoff scenarios, is that I don't have the exact statistic, but I know that the Celtics record, mostly against Tony Brothers, is not very good. And so they hopefully can avoid him the rest of this series because they always seem to lose games that he referees. And I'm not saying that he's biased, but he's pretty biased.
Yeah, I mean, officiating plays a lot in the NBA, especially. I mean, more than any other sport. You can call these random fouls. You can call anything you really want, basically.
And his amazing counterpart, Scott Foster, seems to have a pretty big rivalry with James Harden for whatever reason. I don't know the history between those two, but pretty interesting. Speaking of James Harden, now we're going to get into the MVP discussion. Should James Harden or Giannis Antetokounmpo win the MVP? And we are very conflicted on this, clearly, as you're going to see.
I don't know. Who do you think should win the MVP, Oliver?
2 words. James Harden.
See, let me tell you why you're wrong. Giannis Antetokounmpo, the Greek freak, absolute menace. I can't see why he would not win the MVP this year.
Well, let's get into it. Looking at the statistics, James Harden first in the NBA with 36.1 points per game. Giannis ranks third in the NBA with 27. Giannis is also 6th in the league in rebounds with 12.5, which means he's averaging a double-double for the year. Pretty impressive. James Harden has 6.6 rebounds per game, which is good for 46th in the NBA. Pretty impressive for a guard, but when you're comparing him to a guy who's 6'11",
yeah, rebounds,
there's obviously going to be a difference.
Very, very tough thing to compare.
In terms of assists, Giannis averages 5.9 assists per game, which is tied for 21st in the NBA. Pretty solid for a big guy, but you've seen that Milwaukee likes to run him at point guard or the guard position sometimes as well. Harden, on the other hand, has 7.5 assists per game, which is good for 8th in the league. In terms of player efficiency rating, really close here. Giannis had a 30.95 PER, which is best in the NBA. Harden right behind him with a 30.62. And one interesting thing I'd like to point out here is that Anthony Davis also has a 30-plus player efficiency rating, but no other player in the NBA has above a 26. So you're seeing that these guys are really the cream of the crop, especially because Anthony Davis didn't play many games this year.
If that right there doesn't signify the difficulty of choosing who the MVP will be this season, I don't know what does. The two of the three players that have above a 30-plus PER, they're just tearing it up this year. It's a super hard discussion, but let's get into it.
I think it's important to mention before we get going that any other year, each of these guys would easily run away with the MVP. The difficulty of this decision comes from the fact that they're both having historical seasons at the same time.
Yeah, as we saw, James Harden won the MVP last year, trying to repeat Giannis' breakout season. I mean, like you said, 2 different years, no question about it. This year, they're both clashing at the top at the same time. It's a hard decision.
Okay, so let's get into the case for Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Well, Milwaukee Bucks star Giannis Antetokounmpo was the league's most consistently brilliant performer of the 2018 regular season. I mean, let's look at the Bucks roster. Without Giannis, the Bucks are garbage. I mean, literal buns. They are cheeks, Oliver. Without Giannis, the Bucks won 60 games this season. Without Giannis, I think the Bucks are a 45-win team at best.
I think that you have a point that the Bucks are very limited without Giannis, but you have to admit they also have guys. Nikola Mirotic isn't exactly a slouch. Eric Bledsoe just signed a $100 million contract extension. Malcolm Brogdon won Rookie of the Year. Oh, and also we can't forget about All-Star Chris Middleton this year, who's another guy who can really shoot the ball and certainly contributes to those 5.9 assists per game that Giannis has.
A poor man's Klay Thompson, as I like to call him. But like I said, Giannis Antetokounmpo, just an absolute beast this season. He's been tearing it up. He can score basically whenever he wants. We saw he can get shut down if teams help early, slide early. But if he's in his zone, if he's attacking the paint like he wants to, you brought up a couple episodes ago, he can shoot the 3 ball. Not great. He can shoot it, though, so that's an option, unlike Ben Simmons. So he can drive or he can step back and shoot the ball.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that really limits Giannis is his inability to really shoot the ball very well. Like you said, he's still able to knock them down when he's given the opportunity, but I would much rather see a guy like Chris Middleton or Bledsoe shoot the ball just on the Bucks and tons of other great shooters in the NBA, but I'd much rather see them taking shots than Giannis. So I think that's one thing that really hurts him. Another thing that you brought up is consistency. And so I think while Giannis definitely was consistent this year, you can't discount the fact that James Harden scored 30-plus points for 32 games in a row. The only thing that kept him from continuing that streak was the fact that the Atlanta Hawks literally put 5 guys on him at the end of the game to ensure that he wouldn't get his final points, to ensure that he got another 30-point game. And during that time, he didn't have Clint Capella for a stretch because Capella had a broken bone in his arm, and Chris Paul was also out with a hamstring injury. And at that point in the year, the team was on the ropes. They had a chance that they weren't even going to make the playoffs. They were 11-14. They end up going 21-11 during that next stretch where Harden really took over.
Yeah, bringing it back to that point, how would these two teams fare without their superstars? I mean, like you said, the Rockets would be struggling to get into the playoffs, maybe slip into the 7 or 8 seed as we see in the West. Still keep in mind, later in the season, hey, in the Western Conference, but like we said, without Giannis, the Bucks would be in the same situation, trying to get into the playoffs, 40-win team. Anyway, I'm glad you brought up that 30 for 30 Harden streak. They made a little documentary about it on ESPN because of it. It was so historic. But during that 32-game stretch where Harden scored 30 or more points a game, he made 358 field goals during that streak, and he had one more field goal during that streak than he had free throws. So he had 357 free throws made, not attempted, during that streak.
James Harden did lead the NBA in free throws attempted this year. He also led them in free throws made. He shot 88%. But when you're talking about free throws, it's not exactly like Giannis doesn't get calls.
Oh, definitely.
Especially, you could see it in the Celtics series. He goes to drive, he gets fouled.
Mm-hmm. Same thing with James Harden.
It's part of it's his long arms, but the one thing that stands out to me is that he shoots 73% at the line. And like we were talking about with the jump shot, you'd like to see him improve that a little bit, especially when he gets that many calls.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting to the line, you want to take advantage of it. James Harden obviously does a great job of that. We see him during these games get to the line typically around 15 times per game, maybe sink 13 free throws, which helps. I mean, as we see the averages, but we have seen those nights where he gets like 25 free throws and the other team will get like 3. So it's pretty weird to see. What James Harden also has the ability to do is manipulate the refs a little bit. We've seen discussion on his step back, whether or not it's a travel when he does that double step. He also knows how to flail out his legs a little bit, get extra calls from the 3, make 4-point plays. James Harden, just a smart player, but he does take advantage of the rule book.
Right, and I think that a lot of people would agree with me in saying this, but if the referee's going to give you the opportunity to get to the line, score points, win games, you have to take advantage of that. And you see with the friction between Harden and Scott Foster, that Scott Foster is determined to not let Harden get those free points. So I think that both these guys are pretty adept at getting to the line and getting these calls from the referees, which is obviously a good thing.
I mean, yeah, that's what the NBA is now. It's just kind of taking the game into your own hands, trying to manipulate the game.
Kind of adding, or going back to your point about being valuable to the team, Harden added 28 wins this year, and by the statistics put out by ESPN. Giannis added 22 wins, so decently close there, but I think you would probably agree with this, that wins count a lot more in the Western Conference, where everyone's so close together. Much tougher schedules. Another statistic that ESPN put out is called value added, which takes a player's stats relative to their team's record, and sees how crucial the player is. So Harden has an 839.5 rating. Giannis is second there with 664, but you can see there's a pretty big difference there. And third place was Karl Anthony Towns with a 599.6. So I just put that third player in there just so you can see the difference and gap. It's almost 200 points between Harden and Giannis, and much closer to 100 or even 50 between Karl Anthony Towns and Giannis.
So value added. Back to that, I mean, obviously some of that comes from those games where he was dropping 30 points a game when they were winning. They went 21-11 during that stretch. The only issue I come into contact with that situation is Milwaukee was such a good team this year that they routinely were blowing out other teams all season. The Bucks had 42 wins of 10 points or more, by far the most in the league. So this sheer amount of blowouts basically limits Antetokounmpo's minutes. Coach takes him out probably, third quarter, which basically just denies him the chance to get over 30 points a lot of the time, like we see with James Harden.
Definitely. Giannis did have a pretty high usage rate, but James Harden led the NBA by a pretty substantial margin in the usage rate. But you also have to factor in, like you just said, a lot of the Rockets games were really close, and these shots that James Harden was hitting weren't exactly shots to put them up by 20. It was more shots to put them up by 1 or 2 points that were really crucial. One shot, when you talk about an MVP moment, I think that when Harden hit that game winner in Oakland against the Warriors, that was a really impressive play to me. He basically willed his team to victory, and I thought that was pretty impressive. Speaking of scoring, to go back to how historic Harden's season's been, he had 9 games this year with 50-plus points, 2 50-point triple-doubles, which is just absolutely incredible. He also had 2 60-plus point games. He joined Will, Jordan, and Kobe as the only players to do that in a season.
That's the Knicks.
He also joined Will Chamberlain as the only players to score 55-plus points in back-to-back games, and just for show, he did that twice this year.
But back to that argument I brought up earlier. So Harden, 37-minute-a-night workload. Giannis averaged under 33 a night, or exactly 400 fewer minutes, which, in turn, is 11 fewer games. So, when we bring it back to these point-per-game stats, these lighting up the scoreboard, like you said, obviously we can't discredit James Harden. He's going out there scoring above 35 points a night, but Giannis is hurt by his superstar helpingness to his team, the weak Eastern Conference. They're blowing out teams. He's not getting in the games. So basically, if you're saying this, Giannis played 11 fewer games than James Harden.
I think that just shows that they can afford to take him out of the game, though. Part of that is that he's a talented player, but part of that is that they have a good team and that they're comfortable taking him out.
Part of that is because Giannis is helping them build up this amazing lead,
exactly.
And then they take. Yeah, I mean, obviously. But James Harden, like you said, when those players went down, he had to elevate his play, but in turn, he was playing longer, he had more opportunities, he didn't have to pass whenever he wanted. That's what I think about when he gets those. Yes, but you know what I mean. That's what I think about when he had those like 60-point games, the 50-point games. If you see how many shots he takes like 40 a night. Mm-hmm. They're gonna go in eventually.
I think that the biggest plus for Harden has always been his isolation game, his ability to create his own shot. And so 47% of Giannis' shots are assisted on compared to 13% from Harden. So you can obviously take that and say, Oh, yeah. Giannis is taking, like, catch-and-shoot shots, things like that. Some of them do come from alley-oops, easy layups, easy dunks, things like that, though, as well. So you have to factor that into his scoring. But 13% assisted shots for Harden. That shows that, A, he basically has no help. Chris Paul is pretty washed at this point. I think we can agree on that.
Also, during that, when Chris Paul was hurt, he was just
Right.
James Harden is an ISO god. That's like his go-to. He's
Right.
a 2K my court player. He can take the ISO ball. He has that step back, but he can get around and
Right.
even dunk the ball.
The big negative for James Harden always has been his defense. This year, this is a stat I found extremely interesting. In players who played more than 50 games, no one was posted up more than James Harden in the NBA. Harden allowed the 8th lowest field goal percentage on post-ups, and he forced the most turnovers in the NBA on post-ups, which I think goes to show that he's making an effort, at least on the defensive end of the floor. He ranked 3rd in the NBA with 2.2 steals per game, and it shows that he's trying to make an impact on both ends of the floor. Granted, not even close to the way that Giannis can with his he's 6'11", he has that huge wingspan, but I think that's pretty impressive, especially as a guy who that's always been considered his biggest weakness. And I think most important is what your peers think. Harden actually won the player vote at the end of the year, 44% of the vote, and Giannis got 39%. So as we've kind of highlighted here, pretty close. But at the same time, it seems like more of the players favor Harden, a guy who could get 30 on you pretty much whenever he wants.
As you said, Harden, you like to see how he's improving his defensive game. That's always going to be a portion where people question, how is he doing this, just like Giannis with his shot. One person we haven't been talking about is Paul George. Oliver, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Paul George is pretty great, and he had a decent argument for Defensive Player of the Year until he decided to basically watch Damian Lillard end his season.
Oh, what, you mean the half-court shot? The bad shot, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, when a guy's 4 for 7 in that series from 30-plus feet, I wouldn't guard him either. It's above 50%. It's definitely a bad look.
I mean, I love Paul George. As you know, I absolutely terrorize you in 2K with him. He's an all-star player video game-wise. He had a great season, but like you said earlier, with Giannis and Harden having these 2 career seasons, Paul George basically was just left in the dust. He had all-star numbers, as we know, but this particular year, it just wasn't enough for him.
And one thing before we go to wrap it up, I just got a update on my phone, some breaking news. Danny Ainge reportedly suffered a mild heart attack in Milwaukee on Tuesday. He's expected to make a full recovery. Pretty scary. I also suffered a mild heart attack watching the Celtics, but nothing to that degree. Hopefully Danny Ainge does make a full recovery and he's better and gets to watch the Celtics hopefully move on.
Well, we know who caused that heart attack, don't we? Giannis. And I think we can end on that note. All right, well, thank you guys for tuning in to episode 4 of the Two Guys Talk Sports podcast presented by Mr. G's Podcast Productions. I'm Brendan with Oliver. We actually have a new Instagram account called Two Guys Talk Sports. You guys go follow that, and we'll keep up the content. Thanks for listening.